this is a great segue into talking about how this practice of genealogy can actually impact the conversation around reparations. Because
Mm.
this is the second time you've mentioned how you're able to trace the plantation owner and how much money he was paid or
Mm.
she was paid, I don't know, to free your ancestors. And like,
Mm.
this is not too far away, like 2 or 3 generations ago. Let's unpack that a little bit. Let's talk a
Mm.
little bit about how this can affect the conversation about reparations, especially in the Americas in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating because I was in the US last year, and it was interesting for me because the conversation about enslavement and slavery was very much focused on the US. And they
Mm.
didn't ever mention Africa or the Caribbean. And I was kind of jumping up and down going, hello, where do you think people were coming from? But it
Yeah.
was so focused on America. And I can understand that because it happened on American soil,
And South America as well. Funny they didn't mention Brazil because
Yeah.
that's terrible. It was terrible over there in South America.
Yeah, if you look at the Roundtrees, the chocolatiers, they had big plantations in Brazil. There's huge, massive enslaved population in Brazil as well. If you look at this, you can see that, for example, it was only a few generations away. The trading in slaves was abolished in 1807, but it didn't mean you couldn't still have slaves.
Mm.
So in order to actually end the slave trade, the British government paid the plantation owners to free, in inverted commas, their slaves. And because of that, they had to have a register of the slaves. So they started their registers in 1813. They had to write down all of the slaves they had. And then 3 years later, they would have to look at the difference and say who died, who had they sold, how many slaves did they have. And that was so that they could ensure that they weren't actually buying new slaves or that it wasn't happening. Now,
I see.
how much credence you give to that. But it means that we've got these records for a lot of islands and a lot of places of the people.
Mm.
And it's really quite traumatic when you read them. When I go through these registers, I always just read people's names in a way of honouring them and to say, we see you, we know what you went through, you're
Yeah.
just having a moment of being alive again in a sense and honoured. But also we've got the records, and these are online as well, of who owned the plantations, because they would go to the British government and say, well, we've got 6 slaves, 3 women, 1 child, 2 men of working age, and they'd calculate how much they were worth, and then they would be paid by the British government. And the awful thing about this, as I mean, it's all awful, but the British government had to take out so much money to pay this. They had to borrow so much money that British taxpayers, including me, were still paying that debt back. My taxes were contributing towards that debt up until 2015.
What?
So I'm paying in my taxes.
You're joking.
For the loan that was paid to the people who owned my ancestors instead of my ancestors.
How did we not know this? How is this not public knowledge?
The funny thing is, I think the Treasury a while back tweeted something about this and really didn't realise what a reaction they were going to get.
Everybody was saying when it first came out, and everybody was like, what? Like, what?
The British taxpayer were paying for the loan that the British took out to pay slave owners, even though slavery is you see what I mean? Capitalism is always going to drive what is going to drive. I feel like all this talk, I'm just going to be honest here, I feel like all this talk about morality and slavery was wrong and it was our ancestors. I think it's all BS. I think they're lying, and I feel like they would do whatever money requires. And this just goes to show, because if they were doing that up until 2015, even though they knew slavery was wrong, it's like, why are you making us pay for? You should be going to the people that you paid the money to and getting money off them, right?
Well, and that's what our fantastic Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, I love that woman. I mean, she's saying that she's really up for reparations. And there's a plantation still on Barbados owned by Drax. And the MP, I think his name's Richard Drax, is one of the wealthiest people in the south of England. And she's saying, we want reparations, that direct connection.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about reparations, because if I can trace my family to the plantation,
then we should know
who the plantation owner was.
Yeah.
I can trace his family down.
Exactly.
I can see who owes me that money.
Yeah. Like, we can get logical with this. This is maths. We can be.
It's maths and genealogy.
Yeah.
This is why it's important, Hamid, when you were asking about the importance.
Yes, this is one of the reasons why it's important. I find that just flabbergasting, that the fact that they thought that was okay. And didn't anyone ask them, why didn't you just go to, because we know slavery was wrong. We know this thing shouldn't have happened, why don't you go to the people, that the plantation owners, and get that money back and get them to pay back? Like,
Well, I
that
mean,
would have
this
been the
is-
smart thing to do from the British government's perspective.
Well, I mean, I think it's because in 1813, 34, they took out this money, which was, I think, the equivalent of something like 85 billion or something ridiculous like that. Don't quote me on that. But they took out that loan and paid the slave owners. Then the government's been paying that loan back ever since. And of course, any loan that the government's paying comes out of taxpayers' money. So it's not like I'm directly paying the government. But my taxes have gone towards that loan, or anybody's taxes. Not just mine, but a small proportion of that has gone towards that loan. We know who some of the families are.
Who are some of the families? Let's put some of who are some of these families that are still benefiting from owning slaves?
Well,
You know,
Drax, I mean, I think the thing is, you know, when you think about, and you just mentioned capitalism, what happened was we were enslaved. We went through emotional and physical torture. The strongest and fittest survived. And then we were left on an island that had been looted. All of its, very much like Africa, had been looted for everything. So we are left on these islands. Those rich white people have left and taken all of the money that they've earned off the back of our enslavement, and they've taken it back to the UK or to France or wherever they were. And then their descendants have lived great lives. Well, I'm generalizing here, but they've had that money, whereas we have had to start from enslavement, build that up. And that's why when people say, oh yeah, it was a long time ago,
it's so annoying.
it's not a long time
it's
ago.
not.
And the fact that we were just looted and then left, you know, after slavery, means that it's taken generations and generations for us to try and build things up on islands where we're not necessarily in charge of the resources sometimes.
Yeah. You know, when people say stuff like that, do you know what? It makes my blood boil. In my head, I know that it's probably because they're ignorant of the reasons behind it, the ignorance of the history, which is why history is so damn important. But I don't have the patience to teach you about that history. So when they say stuff like that, it just annoys me. And I'm like, right now, I'm so angry that I can't even talk to you about the history and explain to you why. I feel like we need people who have that calm, that can always have the patience to educate someone when they say something stupid like, oh, you know, it was a long time ago, get over it, you know, stuff like that. Like, we need people like you, Dr. Vanda.
I'm not the calm one when people say that, I can tell you that for nothing.
Samira, are you calm when people say that? Can you take your time to explain and educate?
I think it's context dependent. I would say I become quite passionate.
Yeah, not me though. I don't have that. But yeah, okay, cool. I'm processing everything you've said. Did you come across any wild stories whilst you were doing the genealogy? Like, did someone find someone in their past that was like, oh, wow, you know, this type of thing? So just any interesting stories that you came across in your time?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you find a murderer in your family 3 or 4 generations back, then it's really quite exotic and quite funny, you know, whereas you probably wouldn't think that if it was your dad or your cousin or something. So time does make these things different. I mean, I think for me, I've found a great grandmother who could be a freed Negro who owned slaves. For me, that was absolutely okay. What do I do about this? I mean, you can argue it was the economics of the time, so it was better for her not to be enslaved and to have slaves. They might be her relatives. I don't know. She may have bought them. But also, I think anybody who comes from the Caribbean is almost certain somewhere to have had relatives or ancestors who were the children of a slave owner and a slave, an enslaved person. So we can't avoid that because that is what was happening. And I think it really blurs the lines, doesn't it? Because if you are descended from slave owners who got that payment and you are descended from enslaved people, you're kind of asking yourself for that payment in a sense, aren't you? So it's not always as simple as it looks. Someone like Peter Brathwaite has done some really great research and been able to find on the Codrington estate, he was descended from one of the white people in Barbados who made up the slave code. So
who made up the slave code, like wrote the law?
Yeah, the slave code was about how you should treat slaves and what you should do, this sort of thing. So for him, that's deeply awful. But yeah, when I look through the registers and I see names, you know, we know about Cumberbatch. Cumberbatch was on Barbados. You know, I look and I see things like Tyrwhitt. I see, you know, I think there's a family of Tyrwhitts that make shirts. There's names of my friends. I see names like Rollock, so Professor Nicola Rollock, who's a historian of Black history. I see Collymore, Stan Collymore. You know, you see these names, and I think it wasn't always the case that we took slaveholders' names. My father's name was Holmes. I don't know. I haven't seen a Holmes who was the plantation owner, but it might be a few generations before that. So it's really fascinating coming back to surnames and what you were saying, Samara, tracing through what is the meaning of the name. How are we given those names?
Yes.
And you were talking about your name having a specific meaning. And so looking at these things can give us clues. I mean, back in the day, a cooper was somebody who made barrels. We've got lots of smiths because of blacksmiths or all sorts of things. So those names can still carry meanings in some cultures.